Eleanor Vance always moved with the same crisp, dry determination with which she handled her most complex legal cases. There was no room for chance in her life, and her schedule, planned a week in advance, could serve as a benchmark for Swiss watchmakers. 6:45 a.m. Oakwood Lane was still asleep under the grayish November sky, steeped in the scent of wet asphalt and impending snow. She exited the entrance of her luxury condo building. She wore a light gray cashmere suit, custom-tailored in New York, and a coat that let in neither wind nor doubt. Her feet, in expensive structured leather pumps, touched the cold, damp sidewalk. A crucial meeting with one of her key clients, Mr. Rhodes, was scheduled for 9 a.m., and she needed to be in her office an hour early to prepare the final decisive arguments. Ellie took out her key fob and pressed the button. Her black, immaculately clean Mercedes blinked its headlights. At that moment, a thin, heart-wrenching sound cut through the morning silence. A squeak. It wasn't loud, but it was extraordinarily piercing. Something between the screech of an ungreased hinge and a cry. The sound came from the right, near the blind wall of the adjacent building, where an old rusty downspout ran. The attorney, a 63-year-old woman who had built her career on logic and the absence of sentiment, took a deep breath. It instantly triggered a fit of irritation. She didn't have time to bother with stray fauna. She despised cats, considering them the perfect symbol of uselessness, and to anyone who asked, she cited a severe, debilitating allergy. She had almost reached the car door when the sound repeated, longer, breaking off on the inhale, as if whatever was making it lacked the strength to push out that desperate signal. She stopped. Her mind issued a ready-made solution. Get into the car, drive away, call the superintendent or animal control, and let them handle it. Ellie glanced at her watch. 7:05 a.m. The meeting would decide the fate of a major multi-million-dollar merger. Nothing had the right to distract her. She took a step toward the Mercedes. In response, the squeak became more desperate, turning into a weak, trembling moan. That sound, like a tiny, sharp needle, punctured her armor. It was so helpless, so sincerely panicked, that even her steel resolve wavered. She sharply turned her head. At the base of the rusty, thick downspout, receding into the old, unpainted brickwork, something was stirring. It was a kitten, a tiny lump of dirty, matted fur, its face tucked into the narrow space between the pipe and the wall. Ellie muttered loudly to herself, pulling out her keys. Her own voice, dry and firm, sounded unusually harsh in the morning stillness, startling its owner. "Well, fine. What did you get yourself stuck in, you little menace?" The kitten flinched. It tried to pull itself out of the narrow space, but only wedged itself deeper into the trap. Ellie saw its eyes. Two shiny, round balls of panic, more like the eyes of a nocturnal forest predator than a typical house pet. This gaze, full of terror, made her do something she hadn't done in 20 years. Stop mid-plan. She felt a strange, burning pressure building beneath her ribs. It wasn't compassion. No, it was fury. Fury that this miserable, dirty creature had dared to interrupt her perfect schedule, her flawlessly planned day. The squeak became intermittent, almost silent. Irritation finally outweighed all reason. She threw the key fob onto the hood of the car, abruptly crouching down, not caring that her expensive suit would gather all the dust and grime from the sidewalk. She had to lower herself onto the damp, searingly cold asphalt to thread her hand into the narrow gap. The brickwork was rough as sandpaper. A sharp edge scratched the skin on her wrist, but she didn't notice. She gritted her teeth, feeling the adrenaline, usually reserved for the courtroom, now surging through her veins for some lousy, unwanted kitten. After a long minute of struggle, filled with hissing and her own muffled, unprintable grumbling, her fingers finally found something soft and hot. She pulled gently, and the small lump came into the light. It was unbelievably light, as if its bones were hollow. Her wrist burned from the scratches, and the cashmere on her knees was hopelessly stained. Ellie lifted the animal. It didn't fight or bite. It simply lay still, its tiny head pressed against the crook of her elbow. She felt its heartbeat, frantic and panicked, trembling in her palm. The kitten weighed less than her cell phone. At that moment, she knew that her meeting with Mr. Rhodes had just been cancelled. "Well, buddy, looks like you just won the round, but you ruined my day," she said quietly. She stood up, feeling the icy air instantly cool the wet patches on her knees. Now, in her hands, she held not just a stray kitten, but a living, beating creature, barely clinging to life. And to leave it here to die in a dirty gutter suddenly felt like the most shameful defeat of her entire legal career. "Mr. Rhodes, I apologize, but I won't be able to make it today." "What? I beg your pardon?" The heavy, sharp mixture of bewilderment and superiority immediately thickened in the client's voice. "Ms. Vance, are you joking? We've rescheduled this meeting 3 times, and you know how much depends on this brief." Ellie stood by her Mercedes, still holding the silent, motionless creature in the crook of her elbow. It was wrapped in her expensive silk scarf, and she could feel the cat's warm, feverish heat penetrating the thin fabric. Her hands, which only a minute ago had felt the dirty brick, now held this fragile, undeniable fact. "Unforeseen circumstances. Personal." She spoke clippedly. Her voice lacked the usual smooth, lawyerly politeness, and that seemed to shock Rhodes more than the cancellation itself. "I can send you the draft memo, and we'll conduct a call at 11:30 a.m., no earlier." A short, irritated exhale sounded on the other end of the line. "I'll be at the airport at 11:30. Listen, this is—" He paused, searching for the word. "This is unprofessional, Ellie. You've always been known for never letting personal matters interfere." Her teeth clenched slightly. The cold fury that had risen in her by the downspout was replaced by a strange, almost pleasant feeling of defiance. "This time, Peter, it is interfering, and believe me, it's far more important than your contract. Goodbye." Ellie pressed the disconnect button without waiting for further outrage. She got into the car. The perfectly clean interior, smelling of expensive leather, immediately stood in sharp contrast to the dirty, wet ball of fur. She looked at her knees. The light gray cashmere had an ugly dark stain, and several crimson streaks of clay ground into the fabric. On her wrist, where Ellie had hastily dabbed an antiseptic wipe, the scratch throbbed. 10 minutes, a thought flashed in her mind. I wanted to spend 10 minutes on him, pull him out, take him to the nearest doorstep, and that's it. But now the kitten was in her hands, and its life seemed to depend only on her next step. Rationality, which had been her god and her weapon for the last 40 years, thrashed in agony, trying to find a logical explanation for her action. She couldn't find one. She wanted to get rid of this creature, put him on the sidewalk, brush off her suit, and restore the broken order. But the tiny body, wrapped in silk, was too hot, too quiet. She carefully lifted him. He was the size of her palm. The cat's breathing was shallow and fast, and his body was convulsed by a small, continuous tremor. Up close, she saw that his fur, though thick, was matted and dull, and a grimace of fear was frozen on his flattened, unusual muzzle. His eyes were enormous, the color of old amber, and now, in the bright light of the car's cabin, they looked not just frightened, but filled with an almost primal horror. Ellie turned on the navigation system. She needed something that could transfer the responsibility from her shoulders to someone else's. Not to a doorstep, to specialists. "Find a 24-hour veterinary clinic," she commanded, and the synthetic female voice, completely indifferent to her inner turmoil, immediately found the nearest address on Industrial Drive in the old warehouse district. 20 minutes later, she entered a stuffy, brightly lit room. It smelled of alcohol, iodine, and wet fur. Behind the counter sat a young man in wrinkled green scrubs. He looked tired after the night shift. "I have a cat," Ellie said curtly, not naming the animal. The veterinarian, a young man in his mid-20s, slowly raised his eyes, full of fatigue, and whistled in surprise when he saw her. An elegant woman, clearly accustomed to luxury, with a patch of dirt on her cashmere, pressing a dirty lump to her chest. He carefully took the kitten and placed him on the cold metal table, which intensified the animal's trembling. The doctor quickly palpated the tiny body. His hands, unexpectedly confident and warm, paused momentarily on the kitten's chest. "Interesting specimen," he murmured. His voice was quiet and slightly hoarse. "About a month old. See? Flattened muzzle. Eyes are huge and round. Fur is thick, almost like a wildcat. But he's just a regular alley cat, just an unusual phenotype, rare to see." The doctor frowned. His face became serious. Ellie felt her throat constrict from dryness, as if she were about to deliver a closing argument. "What's wrong with him?" The question sounded not like a plea, but a demand. "Severe exhaustion, dehydration. Pneumonia is starting." The vet shook his head. "I'll tell you right now, the chances are no more than 20%. Unusual kittens like this often get abandoned. People think they're sick, or he's been alone too long. He's on the edge." The doctor looked at her with a gaze that allowed no room for argument or legal maneuvering. This was pure, cold, biological statistics. "And if—" Ellie paused, swallowing. It was humiliating. She, who always controlled every outcome, was now dependent on this young man's opinion and the will of a dying creature. "And if I provide round-the-clock care? If I do everything required?" The vet raised an eyebrow. Genuine surprise was reflected on his face. Then he looked her carefully in the eyes, as if testing her resolve. "Then 50-50. It will be very difficult, very expensive, and it's a battle. He already has the sentence of the streets on him." The attorney straightened up, and her back instantly became as straight as it was in the courtroom. She was not used to losing, especially not because of some sentence. "Very well." Her voice was quiet but resolute. "I'm taking this case. Give me the list, and we'll start right now." The feeling of cold he had lived with since birth suddenly disappeared. It was replaced by something new, frightening but incredibly hot. The tiny body, pulled from the stone trap, now lay in a cloud of soft, slippery fabric that smelled of perfume and something metallic, like an expensive car. But this warmth brought no peace. It only highlighted the chaos raging inside. Every breath was a struggle. His lungs felt filled with wet sand, and that sand painfully pressed against his ribs. The kitten heard the woman's high, authoritative voice carrying him now, and the man's low, even voice, smelling of fatigue and medicine. He lay on a cold metal table, and more than anything in the world, he was afraid that these people, these two large shadows, would finish their strange manipulations and let him go, returning him to the dampness and indifference of the street. He gathered all his last strength to remain motionless so as not to betray his panic. He heard the clipped, dry phrases exchanged between the shadows. Severe exhaustion. Beginning of pneumonia? The vet, Chris, said, not looking up from the prescription sheet. I've given you the full treatment protocol. That includes forced feeding, warming, and strict temperature checks every 2 hours, including overnight. Understood, Ellie replied curtly. Her voice carried the same steel-edged tone she used when accepting a commission from the CEO of a major corporation. Any unusual requirements? Yes. Warmth and humidity are critically important for him. Your apartment, judging by you, is perfectly dry. Chris looked at her flawless suit. He's wild. His phenotype, as I said, is unusual. Flattened muzzle, thick fur. He's not used to household silence or sterility. Any little thing will startle him. You need to minimize stress. And one last thing. You must check his temperature constantly. If it drops below 96 degrees, call me immediately. Ellie spent another 20 minutes meticulously studying the list of medications and precise instructions. She felt her brain, trained to analyze multi-page legal documents, easily digest the regimen for administering antibiotics and nutritional solutions. It was logical. It was action. Action, as always, was her salvation from chaos. Leaving the clinic, the first place she drove to was a 24-hour pharmacy. Her luxury car, abandoned by the doors, looked absurd next to the neon signs and the smell of fried onions wafting through the November air. She emerged with 2 bags full of needleless syringes, droppers, sterile pads, and special kitten milk replacer. Reaching her Oakwood Lane condo, Ellie went straight to the guest bathroom. White Italian tile, perfectly gleaming chrome fixtures. This room had always been a model of sterile order. Impatience boiled inside her. She felt like she was in a race against time. First, she took a shower, washing off the street grime and, more importantly, the feeling of weakness. Then, putting on an old terry-cloth robe that usually collected dust in the back of her closet and which she never wore, Ellie began setting up the hospital. She took a file box, lined it with a soft towel, and placed an electric heating pad wrapped in a thick cloth on the bottom to create an evenly warm cocoon. Then, taking a damp sponge, she began scrubbing the clay stains from her favorite suit. What she saw filled her with despair. The fabric was hopelessly ruined. "Damn it," she whispered into the emptiness. But there was no longer the former fury in the grunt, only a tired acceptance of the inevitable. The kitten, wrapped in the scarf, was transferred to his new temporary home. He made no sound. His enormous amber eyes watched her every move, filled with complete distrust. He looked like a wild animal caught in a trap. The main event of the chapter began at 2:00 a.m. The meeting with Mr. Rhodes, which should have taken place in the morning, faded into the background, becoming an insignificant, distant memory. Her world was now the guest bathroom, the light from a desk lamp muffled by a towel, and the thin beep of a thermometer. Ellie Vance, formerly a top-tier attorney, sat on the floor, a soft pillow supporting her back. She carefully unwrapped the kitten, who immediately started trembling. His breathing was wheezing, like an old creaking mechanism. She took the dropper, filled with warm milk replacer. Bringing it to the tiny, convulsively clenched muzzle, she felt the peak tension of the night. This wasn't a courtroom where she could press with logic. Here she couldn't command or coerce. Here only patience, precision, and the violence dictated by necessity were needed. She squeezed out the first drop. The milk stained his fur. The kitten sharply turned away, letting out a quiet, protesting sound. Ellie remembered Chris's words about forced feeding. She applied force, firmly but gently, holding his head between 2 fingers. After several unsuccessful attempts, she finally saw the tiny tongue reluctantly accept the liquid. After a long, tense 10 minutes, the feeding was over. The kitten immediately fell silent, exhausted from resisting. Ellie wrapped him back in the warm towel and checked his temperature, borderline low. She leaned back against the wall with relief. Her muscles, accustomed to sitting for hours in a perfect posture, ached from the unusual tension. For the first time all day, she felt an acute desire to sleep, but she had to stay awake for 2 more hours. She closed her eyes, not releasing the tiny creature who hadn't found the strength to open his again. The only sound in the huge, quiet condo was the kitten's wheezing breath. She understood that this night would not just be sleepless. This would be the first night of a battle in which she was the judge, the jury, and the only soldier. She felt she was on the verge of losing this case, but if she was going to lose, she would only do so fighting. The only sound in the vast, dead silence of the apartment was a quiet, wet rattle. It pierced through the towel, layering onto the soft electrical hum of the heating pad. It was the sound of life fighting, but one that had already lost too many battles. The rattle sounded not like breathing, but like water boiling in an iron pot, unevenly, with gurgling pauses. Ellie, semi-reclining on the floor of the guest bathroom, caught this sound like Morse code, checking every few seconds whether there was still movement. It was around 1 a.m. Ellie's body had long forgotten comfort. Her back burned from the awkward position, and her neck muscles tensed, turning into 2 hard, painful knots. She was used to fighting on other people's battlegrounds, where the main weapons were a sharp mind and flawless law. Here, on this tiny patch of tile, her weapons were a dropper, a thermometer, and endless, stubborn waiting. She got up, stretching. The old terry cloth of her robe clung unpleasantly to her body. Ellie walked up to the mirror. The woman looking back at her was barely recognizable. Her hair was disheveled, there were dark shadows under her eyes, and her gaze lacked the usual steely confidence. Her pride had vanished. Only pure, undiluted tension remained. At 1:30 a.m. she conducted another feeding. This time the kitten didn't resist. That wasn't a good sign. He didn't even have the strength to protest. The milk poured into the tiny, listless mouth, and she had to be extremely careful that the liquid didn't enter his airways. By 2 a.m., she felt her eyelids becoming heavy, like wet stones. For the first time in 40 years, she was ready to fall asleep right on the floor, with utter disregard for her status and image. She forced herself to stand up, walked to the kitchen, and drank the strongest, scalding coffee. Then she returned and sat next to the box. She couldn't afford to lose because of her own weakness. She looked at the kitten, and she remembered the vet talking about his unusual phenotype. A Pallas's cat, a wild steppe cat that can't survive in captivity. But this creature had been abandoned, betrayed, and now it was clinging to life in a place that was doubly foreign to him. Her thought was interrupted by the faint beep of the thermometer. She carefully unwrapped the towel. The kitten was warm, which was good, but his breathing had become even shallower, almost invisible. She took the thermometer, tucked it under the tiny creature's armpit, and waited. 3 a.m. The most terrifying, dead time of day. Ellie looked at the result. The temperature had dropped critically. She felt her lips suddenly dry up, and a sharp, metallic taste of fear appeared in her mouth. This wasn't the abstract fear she had seen in the eyes of defendants. This was an animal, physical terror in the face of approaching death, which she couldn't overturn with any legal ruling. She took the kitten into her hands. His little body felt frighteningly light, as if all the inner energy holding him in this world had been depleted. She felt his heart through her fingertips, frantic, fast, and arrhythmic, like a bird beating against glass. And then, suddenly, it began to fade. The tremor that constantly shook him abruptly stopped. Pneumonia, exhaustion, the sentence of the streets. All of it crashed down in one moment. The kitten went limp. His head drooped. Ellie leaned in to listen. The wet rattle was gone. Silence. Absolute, ringing, terrifying silence. This was the climax. She had lost. Lost, despite all her efforts, the expensive medications, and the sleepless night. The instinct that had once helped her survive in the cutthroat business world and build this brilliant but cold career kicked in before her brain could panic. She remembered something she had seen in an old medical drama. Chest compressions. She placed the tiny body on her palm. Her trembling hands wouldn't obey at all. She could barely see through the dryness in her eyes. Ellie pressed 2 fingers to his ribcage, gently but firmly. Release. Then, bringing her mouth to his flattened muzzle, she gave a tiny, almost weightless puff of air to fill his lungs. Compress, release, puff. She repeated this until her wrists ached from the tension and her own breathing became choppy and ragged. She wasn't looking at the clock. She wasn't thinking about the meeting, the suit, or her reputation. She was only thinking that she would not surrender without a fight. And suddenly, through the grating sound of her own breathing, she heard a faint, completely uncertain, but distinct inhale. Then another. The wet rattle returned, but it was slightly deeper, less panicked. The life she held in her hands had let go for a second, and then fiercely gripped her again. Ellie leaned back against the wall. A salty taste suddenly flooded her mouth. She didn't immediately understand what it was. Her eyes burned, but they were watering profusely. The tears she had forbidden herself to shed 20 years ago when she made the decision to become strong and independent were now streaming down her cheeks, mixing with the remnants of sweat and fatigue. It wasn't a cry of sorrow. It was a cry of helplessness, mixed with an exhausting victory. She gripped the cuff of her robe tightly. She was drained, destroyed, but alive. And most importantly, the creature in her hands was alive. What, Mr. Rhodes? What case could be more important than this? The flawless order, the cold glass, and the designer condo created for magazine covers had become the torn fabric of reality. Wires, droppers, a tiny, frightened ball of life breathing in her home. Just a week ago, the Oakwood Lane apartment was a monument to cold legal precision. Leather furniture, dark wood, not a single superfluous vase or trinket. And now, at the center of the guest bathroom, was a temporary hospital. Her old robe lay on the floor, carelessly tossed aside after she checked the kitten's temperature for the 4th time that morning. In the corner, under a perfectly clean towel, stood the box from which that familiar wet rattle now emanated. The air carried the scent of antibiotics, milk, and the faint acrid smell of animal anxiety. At 9:00 a.m., the landline rang. Ellie hadn't used it much recently, but it was the number her daughter Marina called. She left the bathroom, trying not to wake the kitten sleeping on the heating pad, and picked up the receiver in the living room. "Mom, I have one question for you." Marina began without a greeting. Her voice was sharp and tense, like a stretched wire. "Did you really cancel the meeting with Rhodes?" Ellie inhaled. She felt her shoulder blades tense. Over the past 24 hours, she had grown unused to such direct, judgmental pressure. "I already explained to Peter Rhodes that unforeseen circumstances arose," she replied, deliberately using her driest, most professional tone. "Unforeseen circumstances." Marina laughed, and the sound was like a crack across the apartment's perfect silence. Mom, Rhodes called me. He said that after your unforeseen circumstances, he got rejected on a $500,000 deal for some trivial thing that, as he put it, squeaks like an animal. What is that trivial thing, Mom? What could possibly be more important? Ellie walked toward the window. The autumn rain beat against the glass, blurring the outlines of the city. The trivial thing, Marina, is a living creature. She paused, savoring the moment when control was back in her hands. It's a kitten. A silence fell. A silence louder than any scream. A stray kitten? Have you gone crazy? Marina's tone instantly changed from questioning to accusatory. Ellie looked out at the street where she had found the creature a few days ago and thought about how easily Marina said the word stray, as if it were just trash to be discarded. Marina, don't you dare speak to me in that tone. I don't have to report to you. Her tone dropped to the dangerous low bass that always made opponents in courtrooms turn pale. I'm your daughter, and I have the right to worry when my mother, who has always been characterized by iron logic, suddenly blows up multi-million-dollar contracts to play rescuer. You're not answering texts. You canceled your tennis match and refused to go to the doctor to check your... Marina faltered. Mom, you're acting weird. A pause ensued, filled only with Ellie's heavy breathing. She felt her temples tighten with a sudden headache. Marina wasn't afraid of her. She was judging her. All her life, Marina had looked up to her as a monument, an example that could not be let down, and now that monument had cracked. Maybe I need to have my head checked. Is that what you're suggesting, Marina? Senile mental changes? Ellie finally said, slowly and venomously, as if savoring every word. I'm just saying this isn't like you. You've always done what was necessary. You've won 47 cases. You raised me alone. You built this career so we could both live comfortably. And for what? To lose all that over this useless animal? At that moment, something inside Ellie, something cold and cemented by years, shattered. She straightened abruptly, her neck tensing, her gaze fixed on her reflection in the glass. The reflection of a woman with puffy eyes in an old robe. I've always done what was necessary, and you and all my partners and all those pathetic clients with their pathetic millions always knew what to expect from me. I was as predictable as the court docket. She raised her voice, and it rang with unreleased anger. And what did I get in return, Marina? A cold apartment and the feeling that I had no one to reach out to? For the first time, I'm doing what I want. I'm saving someone everyone else discarded. This is my case. It's my choice, and it's more important than anything I've done in the last 20 years. In the silence after her cry, she heard Marina swallow on the other end of the line. You're just tired, Mom. Get some rest. I'll call you back tomorrow when you've calmed down. No, Marina, don't call back. I'm not going to calm down. I think I just found myself. Ellie slammed the disconnect button. The heavy plastic phone fell onto the soft rug, silently, like snow. Her nostrils burned, and the echo of her shout resonated in her chest. She felt her feet trembling as if she had run a marathon. Slowly, almost crawling, she returned to the bathroom. The kitten, disturbed by the loud sound, moved his whiskers slightly but didn't wake up. He was so small, so weak, and his life hung by a thread. Ellie sank to the floor, leaning her elbow against the cold tile. She looked at his peacefully sleeping face, at the flattened shape of his nose, at his thick, though disheveled fur. "At least you don't judge me," she whispered. And now, in her voice, there was not rage, but deep, exhausting tenderness. She extended her fingers and gently touched his warm, soft ear. She felt she had made a choice she couldn't explain to her daughter or her colleagues. She had chosen a hopeless, unprofitable, yet vital case, and now she had to win it. Ellie didn't recognize her office. This was her personal bastion, the place where multi-million-dollar deals were born and careers were broken. In her ideal life, order reigned here. A dark oak desk, a leather chair, a silence broken only by the rare click of an expensive fountain pen. Now it was the headquarters of a military operation conducted at 4 a.m. The thick drapes, which always shut out the world, now seemed dusty and unnecessary. Instead of folders labeled Rhodes or Case Number 47, the desk held printouts with strange names: Panleukopenia, Feliferon, Bitriel. The cold light of the desk lamp didn't illuminate. It merely picked out details from the darkness: cookie crumbs, a dirty coffee mug, a low-battery phone that Ellie was charging without letting go of it. The pungent smell of old coffee, ingrained in the carpet, hung in the air, and through it a thin, sharp layer of hospital, disinfectant, and medicine pierced through. For a week, she had been waging this war against the system she herself had helped create, a system that ran on money, on large volumes, on contracts, but not on saving a single ounce of life. At 8 p.m., the young vet called. "Ms. Vance, I have to give you bad news. We double-checked. The specific antibiotic, Fortivit, that we need." The doctor's voice was even, like a line on a heart monitor, which only intensified the anxiety. "It's not in any city pharmacy. Suppliers can only deliver by next Wednesday. And your patient, with his pneumonia, doesn't have a week." Ellie felt her chest constrict, and a weight pressed down on her shoulders. Wednesday? That meant certain death. She clenched her fingers around a pencil so tightly the wood cracked and closed her eyes. "Tell me the name of the drug, its dosage, the manufacturer, and the address of the central warehouse in the city. Quickly." Her voice was clipped, without a hint of doubt. The doctor dictated the information. Ellie opened her laptop. No more elegant legal databases. There were only screaming yellow pages with phone numbers for warehouses and logistics companies. She started calling. 9 p.m., 10 p.m., 11 p.m. "Sorry, the warehouse is closed. The drug is only available by order." "Ms. Vance, we don't deal with private individuals. You need a license." In response to every refusal, the old, predatory lawyer in her awoke, the one who knew how to circumvent the rules. Her wrists ached from dialing, but she didn't stop. She began to use her former status, tone, and connections. "Listen to me carefully," she said into the phone to a warehouse manager trying to fob her off with standard phrases. "I know who your founder is. I handled his illegal privatization case 7 years ago. You will tell me right now which neighboring state has this drug, or tomorrow morning I will raise the question of how legally your warehouse occupies that land. I am not talking about an order. I am talking about a life." On the other end, the manager swallowed. "The city of Greenwood," the manager exhaled slowly. "There's a small private clinic there. They have some in stock, but they'd never sell it." Greenwood was 200 miles away. Ellie found the clinic's number, but they politely refused. "It's our reserve. We're sorry." "I'll pay double the price," Ellie stated. "We are a treatment organization, not a commercial one. I'll pay triple the price. Plus, I'll pay for the immediate flight of a courier." She felt her neck burning with tension. "Do you understand that I'm offering you compensation? that will cover 2 years of your inventory? I'm ready to transfer the money to the chief doctor's personal account right now." The chief doctor, a man with a weary voice, paused. "I understand, but delivery, that's 200 miles, overnight." "Not your problem," Ellie cut him off. "My problem is the logistics. Yours is only to release the drug. 10 minutes to think it over. The name of a courier who agrees to leave right now, and my personal driver will pick him up from Greenwood." 8 minutes later, he called back. "Agreed, but your driver won't make it. We found a private individual. He's leaving immediately. He needs a prepayment for the medication and the rush fee. $1,500 cash." Ellie agreed without blinking. She quickly transferred the money and felt her legs under the desk grow stiff, as if she had been sitting motionless for 24 hours straight. This feeling of muscle pain, dull heaviness in her elbows and the back of her head, was a signal of victory for her. She had done what the system considered impossible. She had won time. It was early, 4:00 a.m. Ellie sat in the living room, hugging the sleeping but still weak Kitten to her, when the doorbell rang. Standing on the threshold was a young man in a hoodie, exhausted from the long drive, with a small, sealed package in his hand. "You're Eleanor Vance?" His voice was quiet. "I am." She took the package, handed him the remaining cash for the delivery. The courier, counting the bills, looked up at her with heavy eyes. "Someone's lucky to have you," he said, nodding at the package. "Rarely see people fight like that for an animal." Ellie just nodded silently. She closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the cold draft seeping from the hallway. This man, a simple courier, knowing nothing of her millions and titles, saw in her what her daughter hadn't, a clean, irrational will to win. She walked over to the Kitten. She knew she had done everything she could, and even more. Now all that remained was to wait for how his tiny, stubborn heart would react. 5 years ago, Ellie stood in the Supreme Court, where her 48th major case was being heard. She remembered that day in minute detail, the scent of heated dust and expensive wood filling the quiet hall, the crisp whiteness of her opponent's starched shirt, and the heaviness of her leather briefcase. She won, as always. The main thing she had taught herself and Marina was control. Complete, emotionless control over the situation, the facts, and herself. That evening, when Marina, then a college student, happily called to congratulate her, Ellie had only said coldly, "A win is not an emotional high, Marina. It's a logical, calculated result. Don't waste energy on excitement." She ended the conversation and returned to the next document. There had never been room for irrationality or sentimentality in her life. Now, on the 10th day of the battle for a tiny life, that principle seemed as distant as the life she had led before meeting the downspout. It was the second week Ellie had been living in emergency mode. She had learned to set her alarm for every 3 hours, day and night. It wasn't loud, but it was piercing, and she had learned to react to it even before opening her eyes. She was no longer ashamed of the old house robe she slept in. She stopped styling her hair, stopped watching the news. Her world had narrowed to 2 states: deep, 2-hour naps and anxious, focused wakefulness. But today, something changed. She woke up to the alarm ringing, but the usual squeak from the box did not follow. Fear rushed into her chest in an icy wave. Ellie, without turning on the light, rushed to the box. The Kitten, whom she stubbornly referred to simply as Fighter, wasn't motionless. He lay on the heating pad, but for the first time not curled in a tight defensive ball, but slightly uncurled. Most importantly, his eyes. Until now, they had been cloudy, half closed, as if a thin veil lay over them. Now he was looking at her. The gaze was not frightened, not distant, but clear and, she thought, conscious. The huge dark eyes in the flattened muzzle, which gave him a wild forest beauty, were open. "Hello?" Ellie said, her voice softened to a whisper. Fighter didn't move, only his breathing quickened and the tip of his tail twitched. Once. Then a second time. She extended her hand toward him, expecting him to flinch in fear, as he always did. But he, on the contrary, stretched his thin neck slightly and sniffed her fingers. He reacted weakly to the scent of milk and antibiotics, but then came something she had never seen. The kitten tried to stand up. He lifted his front paws, which looked like thin, broken twigs. His hindquarters trembled but couldn't support the tiny body, and he crashed back down, hitting the soft blanket weakly. Ellie sat down next to the box. The attorney, who only sat in Italian chairs, was now leaning her back against the cold tile of a bathroom. "Come on, Fighter." She didn't know where the word came from. "You're stronger than you look. You've already survived hell." She watched him, unblinking. He lifted himself again, this time focusing all his will on his front paws. He swayed like a pendulum, and then, desperately clinging to the rough blanket, took a step, clumsy, falling, but a step. A second and third followed, only 3 steps, which seemed to cross not the distance to the edge of the box, but a chasm between death and life. On the 4th step, he lost his balance again. Instead of crashing onto the blanket, he tumbled over and landed softly right on Ellie's knees. He was light as an autumn leaf, but in that weight was all the gravity and meaning she had been searching for. Fighter froze, and then, under her fingers, she felt a vibration, faint, but completely unmistakable. The vibration grew into a soft, deep, rumbling purr. He pressed his tiny muzzle into her thigh and began kneading with his front paws, an instinctive movement that signified absolute safety and contentment. At that moment, watching his actions, Ellie realized she had lost. Lost the most important battle of her life, the battle against her own heart. The stubbornness with which she had fought for his life had blossomed into something else, a pure, irrational, burning tenderness. She felt her eyes water, not from fatigue or tension, but from that purr, that sound which was as coveted as a not guilty verdict in the most hopeless cases. She cautiously, almost fearing to startle this fragile miracle, cupped him in her hands. She felt her shoulder numb from the stillness, but she didn't care. He wasn't useless. He wasn't trivial. He was hers. "You won," she sighed, and the scent of medicine and milk that entered her nostrils now seemed the most familiar and comforting aroma in the world. "You defeated me." For the first time in years, Ellie didn't feel like an attorney or a shaper of destinies. She was simply a woman sitting on the floor, holding a tiny but astonishingly strong heart in her hands. All her life, she believed she was saving herself by controlling the world. But at this moment, she clearly realized this kitten had saved her, not the other way around. He had dragged her out of the cold, perfect prison she had built for herself. An unexpected event that completely knocked Ellie out of her new, carefully constructed routine occurred at 2:00 p.m. She was sitting on the living room floor, watching Fighter, named for his incredible will to live, try to climb the leg of the coffee table. The kitten was no longer a helpless rag doll. He was full of purpose, though still ridiculously clumsy. His fur, previously matted and dull, now shone with a dark, almost wild sheen. Ellie, quietly, in a low voice, encouraged him. She, who always demanded discipline and silence from others, was sitting on a beanbag chair, talking to an animal. At that moment, a loud, heavy knocking sounded at the door. Not the bell, but a knock, authoritative, demanding immediate attention. Ellie froze. No one knocked on her door. Everyone used the bell or had the access code. She stood up, feeling her thighs stiff from sitting on the soft beanbag for so long. When she approached the door and looked through the peephole, her heart seemed to stop for a moment, then beat with double force. Standing outside was Marina. Ellie felt a cold sweat run down her temples. She was in her old robe with her hair carelessly tied back, and the house smelled of medicine, kitten formula, and warm wool. Her apartment, her ideal legal bastion, looked as if a hurricane had passed through it. She opened the door. "Mom!" Marina gasped. Her face, always flawlessly made up and severe, showed fatigue and guilt. I came to apologize." Ellie remained silent, leaning her wrist heavily on the doorframe. She looked at her daughter. Marina was dressed in an elegant autumn coat, and that outfit, that image of a successful, self-controlled woman, suddenly reminded Ellie of herself a week ago. "Why?" Ellie asked, her tone inquiring but gentle. "I shouldn't have talked to you like that. I acted like Peter Rhodes. It was despicable." Marina took a step inside. "Can I have some water? And what is that smell?" When Marina entered the living room, she stopped as if hitting an invisible wall. The scene was eloquent. An old blanket lay in the center of the expensive rug, surrounded by a box with droppers, a heating pad, and a small dark lump that immediately flattened itself to the floor upon seeing a person. Marina took off her coat and tossed it onto the back of a chair, as she had done in childhood, which was completely uncharacteristic of her adult, impeccable demeanor. "Good heavens, Mom! What have you done to yourself?" There was no longer judgment in Marina's voice. There was pure, unadulterated horror. She saw her mother's puffy eyes, the snags on her robe, and most importantly, the light in her eyes that hadn't been there for years. "What I had to." Ellie shrugged. It wasn't indifference. It was acceptance. Marina, stepping cautiously, approached the table. She looked at Fighter, who, frightened by the new smell and sound, was trying to crawl under the dresser. "And this? This is the unforeseen circumstance? This is what defeated me outright," Ellie said, walking closer. A long silence followed, broken only by the rustle of autumn leaves outside the window and Marina's short, ragged breathing. "He looks like a wildcat. You're serious that he almost died?" "Just yesterday he could have died, but today he has the will to live." Marina sank to her knees. It was the most incredible sight. A successful PR manager who didn't sit on the ground, even at picnics, now kneeling before a dirty, rescued kitten. Fighter, however, didn't express much trust. "I brought you some hot food. You probably haven't eaten anything but coffee." Marina lowered her voice so much it was almost childish. "Does he need anything?" Silence and peace. Ellie walked over and sat down beside her. They sat on the floor, two women, two generations, and between them, like a fragile bridge, lay Fighter. Marina slowly extended her palm and placed it on the floor. The kitten, overcoming his fear, first sniffed her fingers, then cautiously nudged them with his flattened muzzle. Marina held her breath. "Mom, are you happy?" The question was quiet, barely audible, and it was the most difficult and important of their entire conversation. Ellie looked at Fighter, who was starting to play with a dangling cord from her robe. His movements were still uncertain, but they already had a feline grace. She looked at her daughter, at her face cleansed of the businesswoman mask, at her startled but attentive eyes. "You know, sweetheart," her voice was soft, like warm wax, "I always thought happiness was a victory. When I walked out of the courtroom, I always felt a rush of adrenaline, but an hour later it passed and emptiness remained. But now, when I see him take his first step, when I hear him purr, yes, I think so. It's a very difficult kind of happiness, but it's real." Marina slowly nodded. She took a nearby charging cable and wiggled it slightly. Fighter, seeing the movement, immediately flattened his ears, and then instinctively lunged at the toy. For the first time in a long time, Ellie allowed herself to smile. Not the smile meant for photographers, but a quiet, wrinkled, sincere one. Marina, watching her mother, smiled too. The three of them played with the string toy on the floor. Ellie watched her daughter, always so composed and businesslike, letting go of control, laughing. She watched Marina, then shifted her gaze to the kitten and felt the heaviness lift from her chest. She had won not only life for Fighter, but also a closeness with her daughter that had long been lost under a pile of legal victories. The sense of peace that settled in Ellie was strange and contradictory. Previously, peace meant the calm before the storm, an empty page that needed to be urgently filled with plans. Now it was a warm, heavy feeling in her hands as Fighter, still temporarily named, slept leaning against her thigh. His heartbeat, which she had learned to feel through her skin, was even and calm. In her soul, always filled with anxiety for results and control, silence reigned for the first time. She sat by the window, watching the cars pass on Oakwood Lane, and didn't feel the familiar irritation. Her breathing became deep and measured. Fighter was no longer that pathetic lump. His weight had doubled. His fur had completely fluffed out, becoming dense, like a wild animal's. He could raid chair legs and play with sunbeams, and most importantly, he purred loudly and demandingly when it was time to eat. It was at this moment, when Ellie had relaxed and become accustomed to her new cozy chaos, that her old life caught up with her. On the laptop screen, which she now only used to view veterinary articles, an invitation to a video conference suddenly popped up. Her former partner, Igor, whom she hadn't spoken to since she broke off the meeting due to unforeseen circumstances, was calling. Ellie put on a structured black blazer over her robe. It was her last tribute to the past. "Eleanor Vance," Igor began. His face was tense and eager. "My partners and I discussed the situation. We have a huge case, the Galatea merger, $200 million. And we need only your experience. We are ready to give you complete carte blanche." Fighter, who was dozing at her feet, suddenly woke up at the sound of his voice. He lifted his head with the flattened muzzle, stretched, and, as if demonstrating his importance, jumped right onto her lap. "I appreciate the trust, Igor." Her voice was clear, as always, but the tone had changed. There was no aggression, only a steady, calm affirmation. "But I have to decline." A silence, so dense that Ellie physically felt Igor clench his jaw, fell on the other end of the line. "You're declining a $200 million case? You don't want to discuss the fee?" His eyes widened. He couldn't believe it. "There's nothing to discuss." She slowly stroked Fighter's dark back. "I have a more important engagement. I won't be returning to the firm full-time, Igor." "But, Ms. Vance, what could be more important? You understand, this is your peak. You lived for this." He tried to appeal to her former ambitious self. Ellie leaned back in her chair. She felt her shoulder joints relaxing. For the first time in years, she didn't need to prove her right to exist through numbers and victories. She looked at Fighter, who, ignoring the important partner on the screen, began chewing on her headphone cord. "You know, Igor, all my life I was looking for an enemy I could defeat to feel strong. I found him. His name is Fighter." She gently touched the tip of the kitten's whiskers. "And he defeated me." She knew this answer was absurd to the world of jurisprudence, but it held absolute, crystal-clear truth. "I can consult for you under the old fee schedule. No more than 1 hour a week and no travel. My priority is here now." She watched Igor finally notice the animal on her lap. Is that your cat? The one because of which—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "This is my path, and I've chosen it. Goodbye, Igor." Ellie ended the call without waiting for a reply. Ellie felt the back of her head, which had always been tense, soften. No sudden guilt, no fear of the future, just pure, absolute calm. She tossed the blazer aside. She looked at Fighter, who was done playing with the cord and was now intently studying her ring with the large stone. She leaned down and hugged him. His small, stubborn heart beat evenly. This was her salvation. Not $200 million, not 48 won cases, but this tiny wild cat who demanded warmth, attention, and love, and in return pulled her out of the block of ice she had turned herself into. She hadn't found salvation. It had found her, locked in her golden cage, waiting behind the downspout. A peaceful scene unfolded in a small animal shelter on the outskirts of the city. 3 months after that cold morning by the downspout, Ellie sat in a small, clean office that she herself had named the Legal Department for Tail Protection. The scent of bleach, warm dog fur, and fresh hay layered over the faint, almost imperceptible aroma of old paper and coffee. This was her new office. She was bent over a printed legal statement, clearly and ruthlessly formulating a lawsuit against an unscrupulous breeder. Her structured black blazer was now always worn over a soft wool sweater. The gray in her hair, which she used to carefully mask, was now simply a fact, accepted like everything else in her new life. Nearby, on an old worn sofa she had brought from her garage, Fighter slept. He had grown but retained his unusual, wild appearance that had once made the vet whistle. Thick, dark fur, large, round amber eyes, and a flattened muzzle indeed gave him the look of a small forest animal. However, as the doctor said, he was just a healthy, strong, ordinary house cat with an unusual phenotype. He was completely domesticated, demanding, and incredibly playful. At the moment, he was sprawled on a pile of legal documents, demonstrating complete indifference to jurisprudence. Ellie didn't feel retired. She felt that for the first time she had found work worthy of her mind and perseverance. Her days were filled not with fighting for money, but fighting for justice. Cold, calculating, but now directed at protecting the most defenseless. The office door opened cautiously. Standing on the threshold was Marina, and beside her, her 6-year-old daughter, Tessa. "Hi, Mom," Marina smiled. Her smile was open and genuine, without a shadow of judgment or worry. "We came to see the new arrivals. Tessa really wanted to." Tessa, a small, serious girl in a bright red jacket, immediately ran up to the sofa. Fighter lazily opened one eye upon seeing the child, but deciding there was no danger, closed it again. Only the tip of his tail slowly twitched across the old court rulings. "Oh, he's so beautiful! He looks like a tiger cub!" Tessa exclaimed. "That's Fighter," Ellie explained calmly. "He's the chief assistant here. He defends the documents from boredom." Marina walked up to the desk. She saw her mother's eyes shining, her shoulders relaxed, and how clearly organized this small office was. "Mom, are you really immersed in this? Rhodes still says you're crazy for turning down Galatea, but I can see you're happy." Rhodes never understood the difference between a victory and meaning. Ellie shrugged. "Grandma?" Tessa finally moved away from the cat, who lifted his head to demand attention. "Aren't you bored? You always worked, wore suits, and now it's just kitties." This question, naive and straight as an arrow, made Ellie catch her breath. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked at the shelter courtyard where puppies were playing in the enclosure. "You know, sweetie," her voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. "I spent 63 years searching for my path. I thought it was paved with leather chairs and marble staircases. I climbed to the top to feel controlled." Then she turned, and the light from the window fell on her face. "But then my path found me." He was sitting behind a downspout on Oakwood Lane, trembling with fear, and turned out to be very, very stubborn. She crouched down to be at eye level with her granddaughter. "Being an attorney at a big firm is like constantly running a marathon, and you feel nothing but exhaustion. But here—" Ellie stretched out her hand and pointed to Fighter. "Here, you feel every tiny heart that starts beating steadily. And every day is a belief in the good we do with our own hands. It's not boring. It's life." Marina walked closer and hugged her mother's shoulders. The gesture was light and natural. "I'm so glad. I want to adopt a kitten, Mom. Will you teach me how to care for one?" "With pleasure. That will be our first case together." Ellie smiled. Together, they left the office to choose a new family member for Marina. Fighter, waking in the silence, jumped off the sofa and, playfully stretching, hopped onto the bookshelf. There, among the strict legal volumes in dark bindings, he found his favorite spot. Curled up right on the spine of the collection of statutes, he began to purr again. A sound that was once a frantic thump had now become a quiet, deep song. The woman who had controlled others' destinies all her life had learned to let go and trust. A small, trembling heart had taught her to be alive again, and now her old life served a new, more important path.